Okay, so let me start by recalling what we did yesterday, essentially. So we were considering a plane tree with n edges chosen uniformly at random in the class of all plane trees with n edges. And we can represent this tree by what I call its contour function. So in combinatorics, people speak about a Dick path. So it's very easy to define. I just remind you the definition. You just move around the tree like this, and you record the distance from the root in this exploration. Okay? So it gives you a path like this. Okay? And then so this is, of course, a random path here. What you do a proper rescaling. So basically, you rescale time here by 1/2n. Okay, this is a rescaling. And space by square root of 2n. Okay. And then the random curve you obtain converges in distribution here as n tend to infinity. Toward the object called the Brownian excursion, which is a random continuous curve defined on the interval 0, 1. And yesterday I gave you the finite dimensional marginals of this process. Okay? So, while I gave you also a hint of the proof just for one-dimensional marginals, but really one-dimensional marginal is the hardest case. Then you can treat very easily k-dimensional marginals. And still you need a tightness argument, which is not too complicated here. Okay, so what I also said yesterday that you can reinterpret this convergence here at the level of trees. You can also state that this the tree itself converges in distribution as n tends to infinity. So this is now in the sense of this Gromov-Hausdorff distance I introduced in the first lecture. Okay, so the tree is viewed as a random compact metric space, and the limit is a kind of what I call a random R tree. So a kind of continuous tree, which is a CRT. And the CRT turns out to be, well, interpreted also as a tree coded by the Brownian excursion. Okay? I introduced this notation here for the tree coded by the continuous function et. Okay? So I've written on the other board just to remind you of the definition of the tree coded by a continuous function. Here I take a continuous function g. These are all definitions I introduced yesterday, so this is just to remind you of the definitions. So basically, the tree coded by the function g, which can be any, say, continuous function from 0, 1 into R plus, starting and ending at 0. So the tree coded by g is defined as a quotient space, if you want, of the interval 0, 1 for this equivalence relation here, which is defined above. Okay. And it is equipped also with an appropriate metric. Okay. So this is the meaning of the definition here of the tree coded by the Brownian excursion. Of course, what is written above is purely deterministic. You start from a deterministic function g, you associate the tree. Here you apply it to a random function, the Brownian excursion, and so you also get a random tree. Okay. There is a minor measurability issue in the sense that you need to know that while the mapping, natural question is whether the mapping that G gives TG is measurable. Okay, but this is really, well, we will see in a while that this mapping is indeed continuous. Okay, so it's even better than measurable. It's continuous if you put the uniform norm here on the function g, and here the Gromov-Hausdorff topology on this object viewed as a compact metric space. Okay? So this is really not a problem, but this will follow from what I'm going to prove in a while. And you need that because you interpret this as a composition of, while the mapping omega in your underlying probability space gives this random function, E, and then the mapping which with the function g associates the tree coded by g. Okay, so you need to know that all this is measurable, but as you will see, this is not a problem. Okay, so before I do that, I want to comment a little bit on the CRT, because of course there are other possible definitions of the same object, and I will give you one, which is I think due to David Aldous, and so I will give this other definition so that you get a better intuition of the object the CRT is, because perhaps, well, this definition is sometimes a bit abstract. You don't see immediately, even if you can interpret it, as I explained it yesterday, as gluing points of the graph of the function g together. This is not very intuitive. I will give a more concrete construction of the CRT, and this is what people call the stick breaking construction of the CRT. Okay, so this is what I'll do. And so the idea is that you start from an infinite stick. In fact, well, the stick will be the half line. So sometimes we say also it's line breaking construction. So you have 0 here. Okay. And you are going to break the half line into finite segments. And how do you do that? You consider a Poisson process point process on the half line, so R plus, with intensity. Not Lebesgue measure, this will be the usual Poisson process if you want, but you multiply the intensity by T. And, well, to be very precise, to have really the same thing as I defined there, I need also a factor 4, which is not important. Okay. So you see the intensity, here this factor T, of course, well, tends to infinity. And so you will have more and more points if you move on the right here toward infinity. Okay, so maybe the first point is here. I call it T1. Maybe the second one is here. I call it T2, and so on. Maybe T3 here, and so on. But essentially, you have more and more points when you move to infinity. Okay. So I will use, in fact, the length of the segments separating two successive points. So I will write x1 equals T1, x2 equals T2 minus T1, and so on. Okay? xp, if you want, equals Tp minus Tp minus 1. Okay, so these are all these lengths. Okay, and these are the line segments well, which I get when breaking, if you want, the half line. Okay, and then well, if you don't like the Poisson process, you can explicitly write down, for instance, the distribution of the vector x1, x2, xp. It's very easy. You have a constant Cp, which I forgot, but which is quite easy to compute. Otherwise, the density is x1 times x1 plus x2 times x1 plus xp exponential minus twice x1 plus xp squared. Okay. So it's a very explicit distribution. Okay. So what do you do now? Well, with these x1, x2, etc., I'm going to construct recursively a tree. So I start with the first branch. So imagine a line segment here, which will have length x1. And then I'm going to attach to this line segment another segment. So for instance, let's say here. And the length of the second segment will be x2. And of course, I need to say, well, what is this point where I attach the line segment? Well, this point is chosen uniformly over the first segment. Okay? So this branching point, I choose it uniformly over the length of the first segment. Okay? And then I continue. I attach a new line segment. So maybe it's attached here. So the length, again, is x3. And this point here is chosen uniformly over the union of the first two line segments. Okay? And so on. I continue this way. I attach more line segments. Maybe one is attached here, maybe, etc. Okay, so just the P segment of length xp is attached at a point chosen uniformly over, well, the P minus 1 first segments. Okay, so I can continue the construction. I can also put an order structure here. I can say that when I attach a segment with probability 1/2, it's on the left or on the right. Okay? So, for instance, this one here was attached on the right. This one is attached on the left here. Okay. But maybe that's not so important, this order structure for the moment. So basically, we can view this object as an R tree. Okay? In the sense I defined yesterday, it's a connected union of line segments. You can define a metric, which is a tree metric. The distance between this point and this point here will be the length of this path here. This makes perfectly sense because you have only line segments. Okay, you can compute length, of course. Okay. So basically now you let P tend to infinity. That is, you attach, in fact, an infinite number of line segments, and the object you get in the limit is the CRT. So I should be a little bit precise. What you need to do, you need to attach infinitely many such line segments, so all segments that you get here. And you also need to take the completion of the space that you have obtained. Otherwise, it's not going to be compact. Okay? So another way of saying it is that if you write, say, what notation will I take? I will call it maybe theta p. Okay? The tree obtained with k segments, with p segments, sorry. So at the p step of the construction, well, your theta p is going to converge as p tends to infinity in the Gromov-Hausdorff sense towards the same object as here. Okay? You can state the result like this. Okay, okay, so that's maybe a more concrete way of viewing the CRT. And okay, so one can relate this construction. I'm not going to do it because it would take too much time. I can relate this construction to the one in terms of the Brownian excursion to see that these are really the same construction viewed in two different ways. Okay. Perhaps one comment that I can make about this also is that when I was mentioning this order structure, here there is an order structure in the CRT, okay? Meaning that in the coding here, really I have a way, well, I have a way of exploring the tree in cyclic order if you want the relation between the tree and this object here, is the fact that you can explore the tree like this. You have an exploration map, just as I was exploring here, if you want. And if I consider this exploration map, well, if I look at the distance from the root here, in this exploration, this will give me the Brownian excursion. Okay, so just the same relation as going from here to here. Okay, this also works in some sense from here to here. Okay. And what is the exploration map? Okay, so maybe I can mention that also. It's, well, in fact, it works in general when I have a tree coded by a function like this. So this function PG, which is just the canonical projection from the interval 0, 1 onto the tree. This is this object here, just the tree. So this function PG can be viewed as an exploration map, or exploration path if you want. Okay, it's precisely gives you a path parameterized by the interval 0, 1 that exactly explores the tree in the way, essentially in the way I'm explaining here. Okay. And this gives you, if you want, an order structure because you explore the tree in a cyclic way. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to exploit, in fact, this order structure in a while. Okay. Okay, maybe I will not say more about that. These are very nice results, but for us, it's just to get a better intuition of the CRT, which is going to play a very important role in the construction of the Brownian map I'm going to describe. Okay, no question about this? Okay, so something I need to define now is...
If you change the density of the Poisson process, you get, okay, instead of taking T squared,
you get a different object, and I think people have studied the class of trees that you can get by such constructions, but changing the distribution. I think there is a paper by Nicolas Curien and Bénédicte Haas which does that, in fact, with just saying, well, what kind of distribution you can take on distances here to get a nice tree and things like that. Okay. But of course, the CRT is, in a sense, a very nice object because it's a universal limit for discrete trees. So here I stated only one result of convergence of discrete trees toward the CRT. Discrete trees are plane trees with n edges. But there are many other models of discrete trees, for instance, Cayley trees, for those who know that, or, which also converge to the CRT. So it's also a kind of universal model of a continuous tree. Okay, so what I want to explain next, maybe I will write it here. I want to explain intervals on the tree G. So I come back to the general deterministic setting where you have a tree coded by a deterministic function G like this. Okay, so if you want, you can take for G the Brownian excursion, but what I'm going to say is very general. Okay, so the idea is basically quite simple. If you have two, that's simple, but it's important that I explain that now because it's going to be useful later. Suppose you take 2 points in your tree, A and B. What's going to be the interval AB? Basically, you are going to use this cyclic exploration I mentioned here to go from A to B, like this. And you will say that the interval AB is just the collection of points in the tree that you visit when you go from A to B like this. Okay? So to give perhaps a more formal definition, I say the following. So I let AB belonging to TG. And of course, these are equivalent classes, okay, in this quotient space. And so I can find a representative in 0, 1 of these 2 points A and B. And I can say that there is the smallest interval ST for ST belonging to 0, 1. So here I have to make a very special convention. I have to view the interval 0, 1 as a circle, okay? Because I identify, if you want, 1 and 0, okay? So it should be obvious that here 1 and 0 correspond to the same point of the tree, so I can identify them, okay? So it's obvious that 0 is always equivalent to 1. Okay? So I need a special convention that if S is greater than T, I can still define this interval. ST is going to be simply the union of S1 and 0T. Okay? So you really should think of the interval 0, 1 as a circle. So you have the point 0 identified to 1, maybe 1/4 here, 1/2 here, 3/4 here. Okay, so if your point S is greater than T, well, the interval ST is just, well, this portion of the circle, if you want. Okay. Okay. So I finish now this. There is a smallest interval ST such that, well, you want S to correspond to the point A. So PS PG of S is equal to A, and PG of T is equal to P. Okay? And, okay, so there is something to prove here. Why there is a smallest interval, but you have to think a little bit about it. It's not too difficult to prove. And then one defines the interval AB as the image under my projection here from 0, 1 to the tree, or if you want my exploration path of the interval ST. Okay? So what does it mean? Maybe I can draw a picture here. So if my function g, let's take a simple function g. Okay, like this. Suppose this is my function g. So what is the tree associated with this function? Basically, I told you that your local minima are going to correspond to branching point. So I have a branching point here. Okay, I have another branching point here, maybe. Something like that. Okay. Okay, and here maybe I get this and this, okay? So that's the tree TG here. Okay, suppose my point A is here, and my point B is here. So this means that A is somewhere, corresponds to these 2 points here, okay? Okay, A corresponds, say, to S and S prime. Okay? Okay, and say that so the point B is going to be somewhere here. So possibly it corresponds to these 2 points. There may be more than 2 points in one equivalence class, but let's say typically it will be 2 points. Okay, so what is the smallest interval now with these properties? Well, typically, if you want, I'm saying that AB is going the image under the projection of the interval S prime T. Okay? And this really corresponds, I should use a different color, think about it, to these red points here. Okay? It's really the smallest interval with the properties I mentioned there. Maybe I should have written, well, okay, it's okay like this. And of course, it's going to be different from BA. Okay, so what is BA? Well, now the difference is that you want your interval, well, the first coordinate of your interval has to correspond to the point B. Okay, so this will be PG of T prime S. This is the smallest interval, okay? So of course, it means that you, instead of going from A to B like this around the tree, you always turn in clockwise order. You need to go from B to A now. So you visit all these points. Okay. Okay, so that's very simple and very elementary, but I wanted to insist on that because it's going to be important when I define the Brownian map at the end of today's lecture or maybe tomorrow. Okay, so no question about that? Okay, so I will come, oh, yeah, I need to do what I promised. The fact that the tree TG depends in a continuous way on the function G. So this is, maybe I can just, this is a lemma I already stated yesterday. I used it, in fact, to deduce this convergence here from this one, okay? To show that if you have convergence of the contour functions, then you also get convergence of the trees. Okay? So lemma says that if you have two functions, I will call them G and H. Say. So I'm not writing it, but of course they satisfy the assumptions that are written above. Then the Gromov-Hausdorff distance between the tree coded by G and the tree coded by H is smaller than twice the supremum norm of G minus H. Okay? So here I use notation F infinity, the sup of F of T between 0 and 1. Okay? So I'm going to prove this lemma. This is really not difficult to prove, and this is useful for us. And it's not difficult to prove, provided you have another definition of the Gromov-Hausdorff distance, which I'm going to give you now. Okay, okay, so and this other definition will also be useful tomorrow when I give the proof of the main result. Okay, so again, I take two compact metric spaces, U1, D1, E2, D2. And I define the following, what we call a correspondence between these two spaces. Between E1 and E2 is a subset, let's call it script capital C, of the Cartesian product E1 times E2, such that, well, basically what you require is that the projection of script C on E1 is the whole of E1, and the projection of E2 is also the whole of E2. Okay, so maybe I'll write it in more precise terms. So you require that for any x in E1, there is at least one x2 belonging to E2, such that x1, x2 belongs to script capital C, And similarly, for any y2 in E2, there is at least one xy1 in E1 with the properties that y1, y2 belong to C. Okay, so basically you have your two spaces, E1 and E2, and you require that you pick a point here, x1 in E1. Well, it is in correspondence with at least one point here, y1, but there can be several such points, okay? So it's not a correspondence, it's not a bijection between the two sets, of course. It's, you just say that any point of one of the spaces has to be in correspondence with points in the first space, okay? Okay, so once you have defined the correspondence, you can also define the distortion of this correspondence. So, distortion of C, basically the distortion will tell you whether the correspondence changes, deforms the matrix. Okay, so what you look at the supremum of D1. So D1 is the distance on the first space, x1, y1. You take 2 points in the first space, and you are going to take also 2 points in the second space, but we will be in correspondence with the points you chose in the first space. So this is the supremum of these differences, where you require that x1 is in correspondence with x2, and y1 is in correspondence with y2. So roughly speaking, you say that while you want to get a bound, in fact, on the difference of the distances, if you take, suppose you take 2 points here, x1 and y1, the distance in E1, and you compare it to the distance in E2 between 2 points in correspondence with x1 and y1. Okay? So now the fact, which is a nice result, not very difficult to prove, by the way, is that the Gromov-Hausdorff distance between E1 and E2, which I defined in the first lecture, is equal exactly to 1/2 the infimum of the distortion of C over all correspondences between E1 and E2. Okay? So you have this alternative formula. So I'm not going to prove it. I would like to have time to prove it because it's a very nice proof. It's not very complicated. It's very nice mathematics. But if you want to see the proof, I think it's in the book which I mentioned in the first lecture by Bourago and Ivanov on metric geometry. So why is this interesting? Well, the first definition I gave for you of the Gromov-Hausdorff distance is not very tractable if you want to compute really Gromov-Hausdorff distances between two spaces. This definition is nice, well, this equality is nice because just to get a bound on the Gromov-Hausdorff distance, basically it will suffice to construct a good correspondence between the two spaces and to bound the distortion of the correspondence. Okay, so this is what we will do. In fact, this is what I will do immediately in an example. Okay, okay, so this was a parenthesis about metric geometry. And now I'm going to use it to prove this lemma. Okay, so we want to prove this inequality here. And as I said, we want to get a bound on the Gromov-Hausdorff distance. So we are going to construct a correspondence between these two spaces. Okay? So build a correspondence between TG and TH. And you construct this correspondence in the following way. It's quite simple. You say that this correspondence will be the set of all pH of S. No, I should write PG of S, sorry. pH of S for all S in 0, 1. Okay, so I remind you that PG is this projection or this exploration path of the tree TG. Okay? So it's what's important here, of course, I take the same value of S here and here. Okay? Now, it's very easy to see that this is a correspondence because, well, if you vary S, you will obtain here all points of the tree TG by definition. And the same here. If you vary S, this gives you all points of the tree TH. Okay? So it's obvious it is a correspondence. So what we need to do, we need to bound its distortion, and then we will apply this. Okay? And so to bound the distortion, we take 2 pairs in the correspondence. So this means that we take ST belonging to 0, 1. And so we want to bound the difference between dg of pg of S, pg of t, and dh between ph of S, ph of t. Okay, this is a quantity that corresponds to this, if you want. If x1, x2 is in the correspondence, well, this means that x1 can be written in this form, x2 can be written in this form. Okay? So we need to bound that, but we just have to use the definition, okay? The definition of dg, which is written above. Okay? So this is the same by definition. Well, the first term is equal to g of S plus g of t minus twice mg of st. And the second term is equal to h of S plus h of 2 minus twice mh of st. Okay? So now it's quite clear what we get, because we have g of S minus h of S. This is bounded above by the sup norm, g minus h. The same for g of t minus h of t. And the same also for this minimum minus mg minus mh is bounded also by the uniform norm. Okay? So you get a bound by 4 times g minus h. Okay? So now you just apply this result here, and instead of 4, so you get 2 here because of factor 1/2, which is here. Okay? Okay. So the proof, you see, is very simple. Once we know, of course, this important fact. Okay, so I will not say more about that. Now we come to the next. Has everybody seen that we leave at 3 o'clock this afternoon from the Andersen Hotel? So I erase it. So I think it's now the third part of the lecture. I will study, if you want, the limits of labels. Okay, so I have maybe to remind you that our goal, the theorem I mentioned in the first lecture, is to get a limiting result in the Gromov-Hausdorff sense for quadrangulation with n faces. And we have seen yesterday that we can associate with the quadrangulation with n faces a pair consisting of a tree tau n and of labels okay. And we can also associate a sign epsilon equals plus or minus 1, but that's not going to be important for me. I can just forget about that. And if this one is uniformly distributed, this one is also uniformly distributed over this set I denoted by capital Tn, bold capital Tn, the set of all labeled trees with n edges. Okay, so what we have seen until now, we have looked at the limit, what happens to this object, tau n. This is the result I just erased, which was there on the board. We have seen what happened to tau n when n tends to infinity. If we rescale it, it converges to the CRT. Okay, now I want to have a similar limit theorem for the labels here. Okay, this is what I'm going to discuss today. And to do so, I will introduce also a coding function for the labels. Okay, so I remind you that I had introduced the contour sequence of tau n. So this is very simple. I remind you of the definition if you want. If your tree is something like this, so un0 is always the root. This is un1, and then you come back. So this will be un2. You explore the tree, and you just un3 will be here, un4, etc. Okay, so you just explore the tree always in contour order, and you record the vertices that you visit. And of course, there are certain vertices which are visited several times, but no matter. Okay, this contour sequence was in fact used to define the contour function of the tree. So C tau n of I was just the generation of un I. This was a contour function. And now I introduced another function that will record now the labels in this evolution. Okay, so I will call it L tau n of I. This will be simply the label. So I put an n here to recall that I deal with the tree tau n. Okay, this will be the label of the vertex uni. Okay, so I do exactly the same. So I explore the tree, and at each step, I keep track of the label of the vertex I am visiting. Okay. Okay, so now we want to understand how this function behaves. Okay. Now, so before stating a limit theorem, I need to introduce some notation, and I need in particular a lemma. And again, this lemma will be valid in a deterministic setting, so I keep the notation which are there. Okay. I have my function g. And this lemma says that the function mg of st so mg is defined there, it's the minimum of g between s and t. Oh, there is a mistake there. Oh, sorry. No, this is s, of course. Excuse me for this. So this function mg of st is non-negative definite. So this means that it have take any S1 SP in 0, 1 and any lambda 1 lambda p in R. If I look at the sum of ij going from 1 to p of lambda I lambda j mg of si sj, this is always the negative. Okay, so again, this is very elementary. Okay, it's just, but well, In fact, when I noticed this property, apparently it was not so well known. If you know an old reference for that, you can tell me. It's not a difficult result at all. I'm going to prove it in a few lines. So here is the proof. Okay, so what you do while you fix your S1 SP, and you also fix the height non-negative, and you define an equivalence relation so your equivalence relation will be defined on the set of I between 1 and P, such that G of Si is greater than or equal to H. And how do you define this equivalence relation? You say that I is equivalent to J if and only if Mj or Mg of Si Sj is greater than or equal to H. Okay? So this is an equivalent relation. I'll let you check that. It's really very easy. Be careful that if you were putting the other inequality, it would not be an equivalent relation. So it's not completely trivial. Okay? But this one is an equivalent relation. And now, suppose I want to compute this sum here. But instead of putting Mg of Si Sj, sorry, I'm going to put the indicator function that the minimum here is greater than H. And now the point is that basically for this indicator to be non-zero, you need Si and Sj to be in the same equivalence relation, in the same equivalence class for this relation. Okay, because it's really the definition. Okay, I is equivalent to J if and only this minimum is greater than H. So you can just sum over all equivalence classes. Okay, and then inside each equivalence class, you can just sum over all I belonging to C. And then what you get, you have no longer indicator function because this property is satisfied. So you just have the sum of lambda I square. Okay? And so obviously this is non-negative. Okay? Okay, so now you just integrate with respect to dH. Okay, this inequality, and this gives you what you want here. Okay. Okay. So this is the proof of the lemma. You see, it's very short. So why do I need this lemma? Well, this will be used now in the next definition, because each time I have a function which is non-negative definite, I can use it to define a Gaussian process. Okay? So definition. The Brownian snake driven by G is the centered Gaussian process so I call it ZG, so indexed by the interval 0, 1, with covariance. Expected value of ZGS, ZGT equals MG. Okay? Okay, so I just needed the lemma for this definition to make sense, because I have this function which is non-negative definite, so I can associate a Gaussian process. Okay, so we will interpret this process in a slightly different way. So until now, I have absolutely no assumption on the function g. Well, the assumptions are written above. G is just continuous, starts and finishes at 0. But if we assume some regularity on g, so say if g is Hölder alpha with any alpha positive, so this will be the case in particular when we take for g a Brownian excursion, then it's not hard to prove that you can find the modification of Zg with continuous sample path. Okay. Just use the classical Kolmogorov lemma. You can very easily bound the increments of the moments of increments of Zg. Okay. Wow, or you can use more elaborate things about Gaussian processes, of course. Okay, so maybe I should have written, in fact, also what you get if you compute the second moment of the increments of this process Zg. Well, you just expand the square, you use the formula which is there, and what you get is just g of s plus g of t minus twice mg of st. So this is what I called, the definition is still there, dg of st. Okay, so this tells you in particular that dg of st equals 0 implies that the gs equals the gt, almost surely. So this means that if s and t correspond to the same point in the tree, tg, coded by g, the value of zg is the same at these 2 points. Okay? And you can, in fact, write this, you can prove something stronger than that using a continuity argument. Now I'm always assuming that we have this property. Okay? Okay. So by a continuity argument, you can also prove that almost surely for every st in 0, 1, you have this property. So this is true if you want outside a single set of probabilities 0, you have this property. Okay, okay, so this is telling you that you can view Zg, okay, can be viewed as indexed by the tree Tg. Okay, because precisely this is saying that S is equivalent to T in the sense of the definition above. So this means that really the function, that ZGS only depends on the equivalence class of S in this Gaussian space. So this really means that ZGS only depends on the corresponding point in the tree Tg. Okay, so and then you can say that you have something which is indexed by the tree, no longer by the interval 0, 1. And this can be viewed, in fact, as Brownian motion indexed by Tg. Okay, so why do I say that? Well, something you can immediately notice from this definition. Well, you have, for instance, Zg0 is equal to 0. This is immediate from this property. Take S equal T equals 0, minimum is 0. And then from this property, you see that ZGT follows a Gaussian distribution with mean 0. And if you take S equals 0, what you get here is simply G of T. Okay? Okay? And G of T is the same as the distance in G between 0 and the point T if you want. Okay. And essentially, this means that, okay. If you pick a point A in your tree, the GA will be distributed according to a Gaussian distribution with mean, with variance, the distance between the root and A. And more generally, if you look at the evolution, start from the root of the tree, which is here, you look at the evolution of labels along the line segment from the root to the point A. Well, this ZG evolves exactly like a linear Brownian motion. Okay, so essentially the increments of your process ZG on line segments of the tree are Brownian increments. And of course, you also have the independence property that if you take two different line segments, the increments are independent. Okay? So maybe I'm not discussing that in more detail, but really the natural way of viewing this object is as Brownian motion indexed by the tree. Okay? But the construction works in a very general setting. So your tree can be very complicated, but it is a simple way of defining Brownian motion indexed by the tree. Okay, maybe I will not say more about that.
So just double check. So every tree coded in this way has countably many branching points, right?
Yeah. It has countably many branching points, yeah. Yeah, certainly.
So we just develop a Wiener process until the next branching, and then when there is a branching, we start another Wiener processes along every branch. That's it.
So that's it.
Yeah.
But the point is that you cannot do that if you have infinitely many branches, you see. You see what I mean? The branching points can be dense. Okay? So the structure of the tree can be very complicated. You cannot say I take a Brownian motion until the next branch, because the next branch will come immediately. Okay. So if you want to define the object, you need something different. This is why I did this and this. But if your tree is very simple, if it has finitely many branches like this, you can do exactly what you say. You take a Wiener process, a Brownian motion like this, up, and then you will take another one here, and you develop like this. Okay? But when your tree is complicated, it's more delicate to define.
But if we understand this from the very beginning, we have a tree, we have a measure, then it's obvious that the corresponding function is
non-negative definite.
Positively definite.
You're right, yeah. You're completely right. I could have taken things in the other way, starting with defining the process on the tree, and if the process is defined, the covariance function, it has to be non-negative definite, and I could recover this. But I'm not sure it's simpler to do that. But you're right. Okay, so well, in fact, the deep reason why this is non-negative definite is that it corresponds to the covariance of a Gaussian process indexed by the tree. Yeah.
Even to a simple covariance, because there you don't have functions, you have sets, right? So, in a sense.
Yeah.
Covariance between functions that are indicators. Like exactly like in Wiener.
Yeah. But as I said, if your tree is very complicated, like the tree, I'm going to deal with the tree coded by a Brownian excursion, and Brownian excursion is a very complicated function, and you have to work a little bit to construct Brownian motion indexed by that. Okay.
What you need is just to have a path leading from 0 to every fixed point.
No. Okay, you may be right. Okay. Okay. So now I come back to my motivation, studying the labels here. So we can maybe erase that. So I'm going to state the theorem. So I will restate the convergence of contour functions. So this is what we saw yesterday. So 1 over square root of 2n c to n of 20. But I will also include the convergence of the labels, these label functions. Okay, so now we have this funny constant 9 over 8 to the power 1/4, which we already saw in the first lecture, and to the power minus 1/4. And what I'm saying is that this converges in distribution as n tends to infinity, again in a functional sense, okay? And we already know what is the limit of the first component, just this Brownian excursion Et. And for the second component, we will get a process which I call Zt, Zt, and the definition of Z is that conditionally on the Brownian excursion, Z is the Brownian snake indexed, well, driven, I should say, driven by. Okay, so in the sense of this definition here. Okay, so okay, so this makes perfectly sense. The Brownian excursion is a nice function to which you can apply this general construction here. And it is also Hölder with exponent alpha if you take any alpha less than 1/2. And so you know that the process will have continuous paths. Okay, okay, so just perhaps to explain a little bit what the process Z is also, you can say that for fixed t in 0, 1, well, conditionally on E, I'm going to use what was written here. So Z is distributed as a normal with variance Et. So another way of saying that is that Zt has the same distribution as square root of Et times n, where n is n0, 1. And you can also pick 2 points, S and T, say. So sorry, this is Zt. And then it's not hard to see that the pair ZS-Zt has the same distribution. So it's a little bit more complicated to write. I'll write it this way, that square root of the minimum between S and T times a normal plus square root of so this is ES, so ES minus this minimum times another normal. And then for the second component, well, the first part is the same. But the second part will be square root of Et minus the minimum times n second. Okay, and here I have my variables n prime, n second, which are all n0, 1 and independent. Okay, so that's almost immediate from the description I gave of the Brownian snake. Okay, you check that on the right side here, well, the covariance between this variable and this one, well, these 2 bits are independent, and okay, and so you get just covariance of this and this, which is just the minimum of the excursion between S and T. Okay, and which is what you want to get for the covariance here. Okay. So I will use these remarks in the proof. So I'm going to, okay, of course I'm not going to give the full proof because there are technical details, but I think I will give the basic ideas. This is most important. So I will start again with the one-dimensional marginals. Okay, so I just pick one S in 0t. And I want to understand. So the first part we already know the convergence. So I will discuss the second part. And it will also be clear, I think, from the argument that the convergence of the second part holds jointly with the convergence of the first component. Okay? So I'm going to study L to n of, okay, I will put integer part because it will be easier. I want to study this. And so I think the definition is still there. This is the label in my tree of the vertex, which I call UN to NS. Okay. Now you have to remember the definitions. So let me look, if you want, at the ancestral line of this vertex. So the root of the tree is somewhere here. And essentially what you know is that the labels increase or decrease. At each step they increase by +1. You have +1, 0, or -1. And because I'm taking the uniform probability measure, all choices along each edge are independent and uniformly distributed over +1, 0, -1. Okay? So if I want to get the label here, I just have to sum a number of IID variables uniform over +1, 0, -1. And how many do I have? The number of variables is just the height of this vertex here. Okay? So this has the same distribution, well, conditionally on the tree, if you want, as a sum from I equals 1 to C to n of 2ns. So I remind you that by definition, well, it's still written there, okay? The height of this vertex is what I call C to n of 2ns of xi I, where the xi's are IID, and they have the same distribution, probability that psi equals, well, let's say they are uniform over -1, 0, 1. So they take each of these values with probability 1/3, okay? Okay, so is this clear? It's just the way the labels are defined, okay? So we want to understand this object. So what you say is that if you, okay, I'm going to renormalize by 1 over square root of 2n, and I take even the square root of this quantity. Okay? So you will see why in a moment. So, in fact, not even in distribution, it's really an equality. I can take these to be the increments over all edges, in fact. Okay. So let me rewrite this. So this is going to be, okay, so I'm going to rewrite this in the form. I'm going to put this quantity here, the height of the vertex, inside the square root here. Multiplied by 1 over square root of C to n of 2ns. And this sum here. Okay. So I changed nothing. You see, I just multiplied and divided it by the same quantity here, the square root of C to n of 2ns. Okay? And now, so what happens? Well, basically here, suppose you condition on the trees if you want. Basically what you get here, you have a sum of centered random variables, a certain number, but divided by square root of the number. So this will be close to a normal distribution. what is the normal distribution, the variance of this normal distribution? It's the variance of the uniform distribution over minus 1, 0, 1. This is 2/3, okay? So this is just the central limit theorem, okay? And on the other hand, you know that what's inside the square root here, while this is the first part of the theorem, it converges to the Brownian excursion. This in distributions, okay? But you have a square root. Okay. Okay, so now everything is fine. I'm not writing it in a very precise way, but basically the product will converge to square root of ET times a normal with this variance. Let me just check. Yeah, that's it. And the normal is going to be independent because essentially if you condition on the tree, the xi are independent also of the tree and so on. Okay. So I think it's really easy to believe that what you get is, so this will give you n to the power minus a quarter. You will have 2 to the power minus a quarter, but I will also write this as square root of 2/3 times the normal. So if I will put the square root of 2/3 on the other side, then you get this funny factor 9/8 to the power a quarter. It comes there. And times this quantity. This converges in distribution to something which is square root of ET times n with these two independent. And n is exactly as here is a normal n01, okay? Okay, basically this is what you wanted because this object here has the same distribution as okay, and jointly also with the Brownian excursion. Okay? So if you want, you get the convergence of one-dimensional marginals, and if you look carefully at the proof, you see everything holds jointly with the convergence here of the first components. Okay. Okay, so that's quite simple. I'm going to do for you a two-dimensional marginals, which is not much more complicated, but which will explain, if you want, why you get this covariance for the limiting process Z. So you pick 2 points, now S and T. And you look at the pair consisting of the labels and you want to say that, well, oh, sorry. I look at the label L2n of 2ns and the label L2n of 2nt. So how can I describe the joint distribution of these labels? Well, it's quite simple. Okay, you play the same game as here, but now you have two vertices. Okay, so maybe they have the same ancestors up to that level, and maybe you have the second vertex here, 20. Okay, and essentially, if you want to compute the labels of these two vertices, well, it's the same game. Along each segment, you add increments which are uniformly distributed over -1, 0, +1. And of course, you will have the same increments up to that level here. Okay? And then, of course, the increments will be independent. Okay? So what is that level? Well, here you are at a level which is, it's easy to see that this level corresponds to the minimum of the contour function between 2ns and 2nt. So this is what I'm going to write C hat n of st. Maybe I should define here. So C at n of st, that's going to be the minimum for I between 2ns and 2nt of C to n of I. Okay? So maybe this is not completely obvious, so let me draw again a picture. When you have your tree, suppose you have a vertex, say A, which is here, a vertex B, which is here. Well, the minimum of the contour function between A and B, if you want, clearly will correspond to the level of the last common ancestor to A and B, to the most recent, or to the level of the most recent common ancestor to A and B. Okay? So this level is the minimum of the contour. Okay? And this is what I'm using here. Okay? So now I can finish writing this. So what happens is that, it's going to be a bit long to write, maybe here. What happens for the first component, I'm going to separate the increments up to that level. So I will have a sum going, if you want, from 1 to this C hat n of st of psi I. Then I will have a sum. Now I can sum the increments of the remaining part of the ancestral line here from 1 to C to n to ns minus this C hat n psi prime I. These are, of course, independent copies of psi. And the same for the other one. So I have the common part, sum from 1 to C hat n of psi I. So these are the same psi I here, plus a sum with independent increments. Okay? So that's more or less obvious. And now you play the same game as here, just with normalization. And maybe I don't write all the details, but what you get a convergence in distribution as n tends to infinity. So you have to normalize properly, of course. Maybe I should not forget the normalization. Square root of 1 over square root of 2n times the vector I'm interested in will converge in the distribution as n tends to infinity. Essentially, the minimum here of this function, this C hat n here, defined like this, because of the first convergence, you see, for the convergence of the first components to the Brownian excursion, this will converge to the minimum of the Brownian motion between S and T. And I will have a square root, for the same reason I had a square root here, times normal variable n, plus this term here will converge to ES minus the minimum times another normal variable n. Okay, I need again the square root. And then the other term have the same form. Square root of ME of ST times n, the same term as here, plus an independent term, square root of ET minus the minimum and second. Okay? And in fact, well, because I have a square root of 2/3 here. Okay. So just by the same argument I used here, you very easily get this. Okay? And now this is, you just have to use what I wrote here. You recover this has the same distribution. And the SCT. Okay. Okay, so, well, you see it's relatively straightforward. I don't want to give too many details. This was for 2-dimensional marginals, but it would work as well for k-dimensional marginals. And so you get this convergence here. Again, you need some tightness argument because you want this to hold in a functional sense. But this gives you essentially the basic ideas of the proof. Okay, the tightness argument is not very difficult. Okay? It's essentially the same that you need to prove the convergence of this to this. It's not more complicated to control the labels. Okay? Okay, so these were basically the main ideas of the proof of the theorem. So to conclude today, well, I will come to the last part. And in the last part, I will explain to you how you can construct now the Brownian map from the object I have just introduced. Okay, so maybe I can. Okay, can you erase that, Dudley? So, come to the definition of the Brownian map. And recall from the first lecture that the Brownian map is supposed to be the limit of these objects, this quadrangulation with n faces, in the sense of Gromov-Hausdorff. And essentially what we have done now, up to now, we have coded these quadrangulations with the random functions, and we know how these random functions behave when n tends to infinity, when the number of faces tend to infinity. So it's not a big surprise that the Brownian map will be defined in terms of these limiting random processes that appear in the limit for the coding functions of quadrangulations. Okay? But the definition is not so easy to understand. So, first of all, I'm going to deal with these two objects here, and I remind you that this is what I explained earlier, and we discussed at that point. This process Z can be viewed as defined on the tree coded by E. Okay? It can be viewed as defined on the tree coded by E. So we really have a process, if you want, ZA indexed by T. So in a sense, okay, just a parenthesis. This is a bit unusual in probability theory. You have a random process which is indexed by a random set. Okay? So it's something, well, one should be a little bit careful when dealing with that. And the good way of thinking of that is really to view Z rather as indexed by the interval 0, 1 as here. Okay. Okay. So this is, okay, a nice stochastic process of the type we are used to. There is no problem here. Here, okay, but still we can speak about that because we know that if A correspond, well, if two values of T correspond to the same point of the tree, the value of Z is the same. Okay, so we can define these objects. Okay. Okay, so we set for every AB belonging to TE something which I'm going to call D0 of AB equals ZA plus ZB. You look at the, so sometimes I call this also the, I told you it was Brownian motion indexed by TE. Sometimes I like to speak about Brownian labels also, so I call this the label of A. Okay. So the label of A plus the label of B minus twice something which is a maximum of two minima. The first one is the minima of Z on the interval AB. And the second one is the minimum of Z on the interval BA. So in the beginning of the lecture, I insisted a little bit on the definition of these intervals, AB and on a tree, and on the fact that these two are not the same interval. Okay? Just there are two ways of going from A to B, or from going to B to, from B to A. So I wanted to explain you why this definition is relevant, but I don't have so much time today. So, so
again, so AB union BA is not everything.
It's not everything, no? No. Yeah. So for instance, imagine your tree is like this. Suppose that A is here and B is here. You will get, so for AB you will get this. No, sorry, this will be BA. Excuse me. So suppose that A is here and B is here. So for AB you will get just this blue part, and for BA you will get only this. So you see, there are lots of things missing. Yeah, sure. Okay, so let me continue the last 5 minutes or so. But I have enough time to give you the definition, but I will explain it more tomorrow, of course. But still, it's interesting to see it immediately. So this function d0, well, of course, it has some properties. It's, of course, d0 of AA is equal to 0. That's obvious. d0 is symmetric. It's also clear. But it does not satisfy the triangle inequality. And perhaps I can explain that also again on a picture. Imagine that you have a situation like this. Here you have a very big branch, so on. Well, here you have many, okay? And suppose that your point A is somewhere here, and your point B is somewhere here. Well, if you compute this quantity here, you will have to look at these two minima. And for going from A to B, well, you will have either to go to visit all these points, so the minimum may be very small, or to go from the other side, but again, you will have to visit many points. Whereas if you put a point C here, okay, you can go from A to C just on this small part of the tree, and from C to B only on this small part of the tree. Okay, so you see, you think about it, you will not have, typically you may have d0 of AB much larger than d0 of AC plus d0 of CA. Okay, you may very well have this property. Okay, so what do you do when you don't have the triangle inequality? Well, you transform this d0 into a function that will satisfy the triangle inequality. So this is what I'm going to call d star. And how can you define it? Well, you take the infimum of the choice of the integer k and of the points which I'm going to write a0, a1, ak. So a0 will be equal to a, and ak will be equal to b. So you interpolate, if you want, between a and b with all these points. And you sum here from I equals 1 to k minus 1, d0 of ab. Okay? So it's now clearly, from the definition, this one satisfies the triangle inequality. And so it's a good candidate for a distance, except that, again, it's only a pseudo-metric. Okay? You may have different points at distance 0. Okay? Well, as usual, what you do, you identify 2 points if they are at distance 0. And now you can define the Brownian map. This is a quotient space. So M infinity is equal to TE quotiented with this equivalent relation, equipped with this star, which gives you a metric now, real distance, on this quotient space. Okay? So you may say at this point that, well, that's a little bit complicated because I defined also this object as a quotient space. So I have a quotient space, I take another quotient. I could have done both quotients at the same time, but in my opinion, this makes things more complicated to understand. Okay? So what I will do tomorrow in the last lecture, I will give hints of the proof of the fact that this object is the right object. It's a limit of rescale the quadrangulations, the result I stated in the first lecture. I will also explain to you why this is relevant. That's very easy to understand from the discrete picture. Okay? Today I had no time to explain it, but I will do that tomorrow. Okay, it's time to stop.